mean, another one we could talk about is what do we do with the tetraploid versus the diploid Loddiglossa, Harrisonii, and all that stuff too. You know, we had that discussion, but we never really finished it.
Well, I don't know that we can finish it, can we? I mean, we've got both of them out there, and we've got 27 centers and what is it, 8 extra sites. Everybody's got their own opinion of how to deal with it.
Yep.
So I don't know that you can. I don't know that you can fix it, Rob. But I think, I think we can come to some conclusion about what we want to do with it. Eventually, maybe it would be a good topic for the judges forum, because we're going to be having more of those online judges forums during the year.
Yeah.
And not just this year, but in the future. So that's a topic I might suggest to Jean Eichson, and see if she thinks that would be a topic that might pull in. I don't know how many people we get on that.
Yeah, but if we broaden it, we might want to do. We could do Phalaenopsis, or we could do Cattleya. Same thing, Walkeriana. The main Walkeriana isn't Walkeriana, so so we're so it could be what are the real species and which ones are actually the hybrids. So in Cattleya we could talk about Araniaca, we could talk about Loddiglossa, we could talk about Harrisonii. We could talk about a lot of those species. What are that we're actually awarding the hybrid. The conclusion is, like you said, I don't know if there's a conclusion. At least we're educated what we're doing.
I think the education part is probably the best part of it. The idea that we can educate people and do a session on, what is it? Is it a species or is it a hybrid?
Right. Well, and then it goes back to the greater discussion is when. A good example is we'll take Phalaenopsis amabilis. If you found a really nice wild form, we wouldn't even nominate it.
Right.
So are we actually? What are we? When we're awarding species, what are we actually really doing?
We've been waiting so long.
Rob, if you send me a list of all these different species, I can put together either a PowerPoint or a website point with the various species, and we can go through them and talk about them. If you want.
It might be, like I said, could do Cattleyas, we could do a, Phalaenopsis, maybe focus on Cattleyas, Phalaenopsis, or one genus, and show, the awarded ones, which ones are really looking at probably hybrid. I mean, well, once again, it's just for discussion purposes, not that we can actually, Taylor said, have any final conclusions, but at least we could be educated, when we're, trying to evaluate something. I'm not sure how we do it. I mean, if we got a really nice wild Bellina in, I'm not sure what I would do with it in terms of an award. I don't know
whether we even know what it looks like.
Well, yeah, I've got for the Phalaenopsis, I've got quite a few wild pictures. So so at least with fails, I could show the wild ones and progressions, over time. I mean, we're getting the same way now with in some of the paths, some of the Sucaculiais, and I was looking at some of those new Rothschildianums. Holy cow, on the pedal.
Yeah, they're all hybrids.
So
some of them, frankly, are not as good as people think they are.
Correct. So I mean, and Bill can chime in there. So some of these a path species may not be exactly true species either.
Yeah.
I'd like to break in with a few words here, if I might.
Please do.
I think we're trying to slay windmills here. Let me tell you an example I have. I brought seed pods of Cattleya Loddiglossa back from Ecuador a number of years ago. And I was able to grow 2 seedlings out of them. One of them has a short, and is from every cross I have tried. Now, the long stem one is very likely a triploid. Comments, Rob?
Yep. No. That's actually pretty common. You know, I mean, we have the same situation with the Phalaenopsis. And what's interesting with the Phalaenopsis is when they were doing the breeding with the phales, the triploids came at a reasonable frequency because of unreduced gametes. And you had certain clones that you had a higher frequency of triploids with. You know, even in Cattleyas, it's a good is jewel box. Some triploid jewel boxes are fertile, some are not fertile. And if you then take the species with the triploid and then self the triploid, you get a bunch of tetraploids and things. So, you know, so the wild, you know, species, every orchid has a frequency of unreduced gametes. And those unreduced gametes, you know, in Mother Nature are usually slower and don't really survive. But, you know, do my flasking, I pick out all of the slower growing tetraploids and, you know, and have tetraploid strains of almost everything because, you know, when you plant 100,000 seedlings, you know, you can find those slower, thicker ones and you pick them out. So any wild, you know, cross, like you said, any selfing or, you know, wild cross, you can find the polyploids pretty easily if you know what you're looking for.
Well, to get back to the pictures looking at Cattleyas, we all know that the color of flowers changes with age. Were these flowers all the same age when the picture was taken? You know, that's the first question I have. And can you judge them on photographs that were taken different numbers of days after they opened? And, you know, you just can't judge flowers without being there to see them and try to determine, you know, how long ago it might have opened. Cymbidiums are notorious for changing color after they open, and especially ones that show reddish shades.
So you hit it on the head with blue Cattleyas. So blue Cattleyas, the reason they're blue, unlike Vandas and things, blue Cattleyas are blue not due to a new pigment. They're due to a pH mutant. And a classical example of that is Loddiglossa blue skies. When it opens, for the first 3 days, it's pink. It doesn't start changing the blue until 4 or 5 days later. So you know, you're right. As the older the flower gets, the more alkaline the flower gets, and the bluer it's actually going to get.
Is the pH of the medium involved in this?
No. It's the pH of the vacuole. So the media doesn't have too much of an effect in terms of a blue with Cattleyas at this particular point. Blue in some other species is related to the metals in the vacuole, and the pH of the media determines what metals are. That's a good example with Laelia milleri. Laelia milleri is a really good red color if it has iron in the vacuole. We can only get iron in the vacuole when you're growing it under acidic-ish, really acidic media. So if you don't have acidic media for milleri, it's going to be orange and not that red, you know, that brilliant red color because it's due to the iron. But, you know, so going back to the Cattleyas, since this is philosophy, you know, my way I look at Cattleyas, and probably is very, very different than the rest of everybody, is how much, you know, for color, I can, don't have to worry about, you know, pointing for the color, because Cattleyas are going to be very pale. You're not going to get them dark because they're a pH mutant. And with a pH mutant, you can't actually get dark blue. It's just not physically possible. My concern is we shouldn't be docking them on shape. You know, I mean, a good example of this is the white mutant Cattleyas of good as shape as the pink ones we're awarding. So why are we letting the shape go just because it's blue? You know, so most of the blue Cattleyas I've looked at have pretty crappy shape, and I wouldn't have awarded them because the shape doesn't match.
So I'm confused, Rob. What are you saying? That we should really concentrate on the shape for pointing?
Well, no. What I was saying is it appears that we're giving them sort of extra brownie points because they're blue, and we don't really dock them for shape. I mean, because if you look at the
Difficulty
comparison of a
points.
white, yeah, I mean, if we look at a white one versus a pink one or whatever, and a blue, lo and behold, the blue ones have poorer shape. So it appears we're compensating and judging them to allow for the shape to be not as good. I mean, that's just, for throwing out philosophy and stuff. I'm not, that's my sort of opinion. I think, we should expect better shape before we award them.
Yeah, but on the other side of that coin, Rob, is you get a rare mutation. You don't get to select the quality or form of that flower that gets that mutation. So you're working from a single plant and trying to better it. So shouldn't you take into consideration the quality of the parent from which it comes, not the group of plants it's coming from?
I would say no. And here's the reason, is we're not awarding a plant from the jungle. So we're awarding things that have been used in breeding. And if you're going to improve a plant in breeding, why wouldn't you cross with a pink or a white? Just like they've done with pinks and whites. To get better whites, they crossed with pinks and then selected the next generation. So in blues, it appears that we've been doing, the breeders are just crossing blue and blue and not really looking at improving them, by like they did with the white and purple Cattleyas, where you intercross the two and then you select for the ones that have the better color. So to me, is some of this stuff that we're awarding 4 or 5 generations out, we should expect them to look like the 4 or 5 generation out white ones, or whatever in terms of shape. I mean, that's my opinion, because they're bred to the same extent.
So, Rob, you're not talking about penalizing the earlier breeding. You're talking about several generations out.
Well, okay, several generations of, for example, right now, several generations out is we'll take the plant we're looking at. We'll take Loddiglossa. Right now, Loddiglossas that we're awarding are 5, 6 generations out. Right. Loddiglossas. Right. So if we're looking at some of the blue mossy eyes, I've looked at, some of the, I've been going through this, a lot of the mossy eyes, they cross blue and blue together, and you still, and you're not getting a great mossy eye. Why haven't they crossed, a white mossy eye with the blue to get a better shape, like they've done, so to me, if you're looking at a blue mossy eye, you should have the shape of a white mossy eye that's bred for the same generations at least. Maybe not the purple ones, but the white ones tend to, well, at this point, white mossias have the same shape as the purple mossias.
The purple ones, yeah.
So why should we accept blue not to?
But we talked also earlier about the fact that these things have been bred so far out, they're not necessarily even really a species anymore.
Yeah, I mean, part of this is there was a really good study done with oncidiums back in the 1950s at St. Louis Botanical Garden. And what they did is many times, and John mentioned that the wild plant has some diversity in it. And many times the diversity in there, and if you look at it, is because, there's some other species. There's not something that's really a pure, honest to goodness species. And then when you cross with it, you can then select for those other traits that are moving into that species, from the genetic makeup of that population. So you're right. I mean, at what point in time do you lose the species itself?
Rob, let me jump in here. What you're saying in that case is we don't have species, we've got hybrids to start with.
Yeah.
Okay. And I can see that in some of the quote unquote species that I'll push a little bit on paths and like Roth and Cicuculei. I mean, line breeding, basically has gone on now since the 1960s for these species. And I think you are old enough to remember Rothschildianum Charles E.
Oh, yeah.
And Chester Hills, and also what's the one from Radcliffe? Saba, and what's the real famous one? The FCC. I forget.
Charles E.
No, not just Charles E. But
Oleodianum Penn Valley.
well, Eliana and Penn Valley. But if you look at these different wild collected Rothschildianums, and still have New Luanu, which has got an HCC. They tended to be quite different in their not only in their flower size but also in their plant size. When you look at Charles E, it's a pretty big plant when it's mature. Got a really big spread. So does Chester Hills. Eliodiana and Penn Valley, not so much. And so there is, in my mind, there is natural variation that's out there, and line breeding these species has tapped into that. I think another good example is Cicuculei. The breakthrough for Cicuculei was when Orchids started using mussels. All of a sudden, you got 2.5 centimeter petals instead of 2 centimeter petals, and that sort of changed the way that we looked at things. But Cicuculei mussels is just a part of the natural variability, if you will, of Cicuculei. So at least with the paths, I see that. I understand with the Cattleyas and some of the Phalaenopsis like Bellina and that, we're almost starting with hybrids. So philosophically speaking, if I'm line breeding Rothschildianums, and now I'm working with stuff that's coming out of Taiwan. Some of that stuff maybe have been treated either mutagenically or with a change in ploidy to induce larger flowers. Now we're getting flowers that are huge, huge flowers on some of these things. But I think you remember. Bob Wellenstein, he pretty much summed it up when he was a student in our region, and said that if you're a breeder and someone comes up with a better species and you're line breeding species, and someone introduces a parent with different genetics and takes the next step, it's not necessarily a hybrid. It's really a species, and we all have to deal with that.
Except if we look at the paths, and this is where I've said there's something more going on. The initial chromosome count on Cicuculei, the wild one that Kurosaka did, they have a different chromosome number, and they're not polyploid. They got extra chromosomes. So each path species actually has a different chromosome number, and it's very interesting. There was a study just done. A lot of the modern path hybrid or modern path species don't have the wild chromosome number. So, so I don't know what that means either. Talking with Phil Cribb, he basically said, oh, don't give up on chromosome numbers. They don't mean anything in paths. Well, I think they sort of do. So I think something is interesting going on with these mutants in the path, like mussels, and stuff like that. The question is, in that normal variability of the species, at what point in time, at what point in time when you're, clearly, well, let me back up. Clearly, nobody would accept the FCC Amabilis that just got awarded from Cruel Smith, not a species. And all it is Amabilis that was bred, for 10 generations. It's hard to call that a species. So what we've done in fails is we've actually gave them, hybrid names.
Yeah, I guess, yes. Hey, Mark.
Can you equate Coerulea to something like the vinicolor paths, where you find a mutation in the genomes and you work with it from there? I mean, it took several generations for those vinicolors to become acceptable, workable plants.
And a lot of them have had really terrible shape for a long time.
Yes, and that's my point. And so, I don't know, maybe if we're dealing with new hybrids and Coerulea forms of Cattleyas, we can give them the same consideration, leeway. Although Coerulea Cattleyas have been around for a long time, a lot longer than the vinicolor path.
But I still remember our judging center is we didn't award many vinicolors because the shape was so bad.
Yep.
So we were one of the few centers that said, well, you know, we can't overcome the shape issues.
Right.
It is interesting on vinicolors now is I think they couldn't overcome the shape issues, and we really don't see some of the true, and Bill, I'm interested in your thinking on this, some of the true real vinicolors like we saw in the early 70s. The vinicolors now are really not the true real vinicolors like the 70s with their black, and things like that. I think what has happened, and we looked at some of the black stuff, and I know Frank has been looking at this stuff from Hawaii, the Sukukulii stuff that has the black petals. There's no real vinicolor in those. They're just getting that black color from the Sukukulii. I don't really see any true vinicolors anymore.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Back in the heyday of Path Fanatics, when they were doing the breeding and Orchid Zone was growing the plants up, you just get these spectacular flat black hybrids. But I think part of it is that if you recall that there were two different sources for the quote unquote vinicolor genes in Callosum. And I my memory's going right now, but I can't quite remember. Maybe Gordon does. But they were bred quite differently. And what they're calling vinicolor now, which is still floating around, I think Sam Soy and Harold Kupowitz have small populations of it, probably from a thing. Very dark dorsal and the really terrible petals that mucked up the shape. But there was another one that I think came out of other California growers. Ed Nash's outfit. Who was that?
Yep. Stewart had that one.
Stewart, yeah. So Stewart.
One of them was Jack. One of the clones was Jack, Callosum Jack.
Yes.
Yeah, that's correct.
Now,
and Sparkling Burgundy was the other one.
Yeah.
So Jack, supposedly, according to Harold Kupowitz, is a different species, whereas Sparkling Burgundy is Callosum. So, and he based upon chromosome number and a whole bunch of other things. So, to me, the other issue comes to be too, and some of these species, when do you call, when are you a splitter and when are you a lumper?
If you're making money out of, you're a splitter. Trust me.
I mean,
But yeah,
has people read the article that just came out in Orchid Digest on the frags? On that philosophy on splitting and lumping in populations? That was a pretty good, philosophical, I think we should all read that, a philosophical argument of, what really is a species.
Yeah, the Frank Cervera issue. But going back to the Callosums, back when vinicolor started out, Jack and Sparkling Burgundy were both considered Callosum. And so when we use our software, or Frank looks back at it and calls up Callosum, he's going to pull up all kinds of progeny from Jack, which is now viniferum, or I think whatever Kupowitz called it. And there was also interbreeding of those going on. So it's a kind of a mess.
Yep. The other mess we've got too is, you remember Wardii, when it first came out, was considered Succuculei. So do you know if people made Wardii Succuculea hybrids and sold them as Succuculea? Do you know if that happened?
I don't know.
They would never do that.
Well, no, they were
Well,
considered
what
the
if-
same species when they first. Wardii was considered Succuculei when it came out of form.
Oh, when I was working, back in the dark ages, when I was working at the Orchid Zone, Terry Root did not have a philosophical blockage from crossing like Moquettianum and Glaucophyllum and Chamberlainianum. He pretty much said they're the same thing. And that's led us to a big mess that we have now in these sequential bloomers.
Yep.
I think some other breeders, myself included, have said if I think this is actually Chamberlainianum latifolium or Victoria reginae, I'm going to keep that line going. Keep that quote species as clean as we can. But again, it's when people have opportunities. Saun, I think SAUN is the hybrid between Wardii and Succuculei.
Yep.
And it's being remade now, and there's some really nice ones. So we got an award on one that was an albinistic one that came out of Lahua.
Oh, wow.
And they're really nice, but they don't look like Succuculeas.
Huh.
They're much more arrowhead shaped. More, you can tell that they're not the same.
Well, that's the same thing with Primulinum. I mean, I got a really nice selfing of Pinocchio that I sent to Ron and to identify, and to Philip Krebs to identify. It came back as Primulinum, and I know it's not Primulinum because I selfed the Pinocchio. So I'm a little hesitant seeing these gigantic Primulinums we're now awarding. They're probably Pinocchio.
Well, you remember back in Philadelphia, I think, Sophia, who was the other guy?
Sophie
Her
Martin?
husband.
Sophie and Lou Martin.
Yeah. So there was we actually have a Solo's Sunshine.
Yep.
And we still have that, and it looks like a Primulinum, but it's nowhere near what they're calling Primulinum now. So
No.
it's a tiny little thing.
Yeah, it's the real.
So what's messed me up really badly is when I did some breeding on Primulinum purpurascens, which is the pastel colored one, and got yellow flavum ones out of it.
Yep.
So I'm like.
So we started off with the Loddiglossa. Where do we go with that?
Well, everybody should have had a chance to go to the website and see what research I did on the parents. And we could go through that if you want, or Rob, you talked to me about Minerva, and then I put together a PowerPoint presentation on Minerva, which I did not distribute or put on the website. Did you want me to run through that PowerPoint?
Well, one of the things that's fairly interesting in this is if you look at the awarded blues, they're all coming from Grenier. Most of the new awarded blues are coming from Grenier. And what Grenier was doing is actually doing pH breeding. So he was taking plants that had the most alkaline pH and then crossing those back in, and has gotten those series of blues that are a little darker and everything else. So one of his things that he looked at is Minerva has the most alkaline pH of any of the blues that he screened, and that goes back to Loddiglossa, blue shadows and things like that. So if you look at Minerva, because it's in the background of almost all these other blues, it gives us a little more perspective of, where those traits are coming from and, what some of that improvement actually is. So, whether Minerva, and I mean, looking at Minerva, I think it got an appropriate award in HCC because of the shape. The problem now is we're now looking at Minerva, and now when we're making crosses, we're saying, oh, they don't have to have a great shape because they use Minerva in it. But yeah, you can show those things. You can see how Minerva is really the building block for most of all the blue hybrids now.
So where are you going with that?
Well, I was going with just to show this is one of the building blocks of blue. So then the thing is, what do we take into account these new ones if they're the same blue and the shape's not too much better? I mean, looking at the new ones, the shapes aren't so good, but we're rewarding them like mad.
I'm still trying to figure out where you're going with this. Are we going to not awarding things that are we looking at stuff differently and what? I mean, enlighten me.
Oh, well, yeah, like I said, my philosophy is we shouldn't be accepting the poorer shape on these, and I think I'm in the minority.
Well, you certainly made that point very clearly. I didn't mean that to sound the way it did. It sounded derogatory, and it wasn't intended to be. I mean, you made the point very clearly. Was what I was meant to say. Specifically, a statement that was a good point. I'm just trying to figure out: are we now? I mean, is our conclusion that blues? Is this the basic answer you get from this? Is that blues really ought to have as good shape as the white Loddiglossa hybrids, or I mean that seems to be the conclusion we're drawing.
Well, I mean, I'll now play the devil's advocate on the other side.
Oh, don't do that.
Okay, now I'll be a Roger Cole. Okay, and so now being Roger Cole, you know me, I can argue both sides. So Roger Cole would be saying, well, we want to look at improvement over the parents. So if the parent looked like X and it's better than the parent, we should then award it. Unlike, the comment that would come back from merit, well, no, we got an absolute standard and forget what the parents look like.
Yeah.
So I think we're back into that discussion on, do we do an absolute standard or we do the parent when we're looking at these? And I'm sort of going in this case, towards the merit approach. So it's like, what should we do as a consensus in this? Do we use the Roger Cole approach or do we use the merit approach? I don't know. I mean,
I think that we take the Merritt Huntington approach because in hybrids with extensive generations, we shouldn't be hamstrung by poor shape in the earlier versions of the hybrids or color. Just because something has a color that we like, if it has
Well, personally, I would like to take into consideration what the clone of the parents are. And if they are the original clones way back when, then I would give them more leniency than if it was just a plain old Loddiglossa crossed with something else.
I think that's a little regressive. I think that if hybridization of a certain hybrid has gone on for many generations, we shouldn't backtrack and recognize something that doesn't have the form or the color that we're expecting now after, I don't know, 8, 10, 12, 20 generations.
So Gordon, you're really on the side of Merrick's at this point in some areas of looking at what amounts to a standard of perfection.
Yes, I think if I were a hybridizer like Roger, I would see the value in narrowly awarding a hybrid because we improved the parents. But in all cases, that doesn't necessarily make the flower good. Just because it's an improvement over the parents, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good by today's standards, by the standards of the current hybridizing in a certain specific hybrid.
So we are not going to award it. We are going to award it. This is a plant that is better than its parents, but it doesn't match the standard in the general area.
That's how I would look at it.
Don't you also have to consider how much breeding has been done in that particular direction? Say in Coerulea breeding, if you only have 1 or 2 people in the world breeding these, you can't expect them to be up to the standards where hundreds of people have been breeding them up to this point.
Well, should you, here's another interesting thing to throw in that I'd like to hear John talk about. So if you're a few people breeding them and you're doing this and you're not a really good breeder because you haven't really used the right parents to actually do a significant improvement, should you compensate for that because you used the wrong parents? I mean, if I was breeding blue Cattleyas, I wouldn't breed 2 crappy looking blue Cattleyas. I'd breed it like they did with white Cattleyas, cross it with a lavender, and then do the back cross to get the better shape into the white. So just because they don't do the right breeding, should we award it?
Yeah, but you have to ask the number of breeders that are actually doing that and have the space, time, and money to put into it, because you're not breeding calves that take up 4 inches of bench space. You're talking about a Cattleya that takes up real estate. And there's not many people that's doing that.
So the Cattleyas are 4 generations, and he you know, raises a couple hundred seedlings. So he could have done it differently, but he didn't. You know, I mean, Stewarts would do it differently, but we don't have Stewarts anymore. You know, so I mean, so the other compensation, if you know, and this is why I think it's really important. Like whoever said that you have to look at some of the clones. And it's very interesting if you look at some of the new whites or the white Cattleyas. You know, some of the crosses weren't always white on white. You know, you had to go back, and that's why they looked at genetics as important as a breeder to know they're recessive. Because what happens is a lot of people would make a cross between a blue and a pink. They're not blue, and you throw out all the seedlings. Well, that's the worst thing you can do. You know, as I was telling Grenier, those pink seedlings will go back to blue because of the recessive gene. You don't want to throw those away. So are we awarding things because the breeder doesn't know what they're doing?
Yeah, that
Yeah,
doesn't
but
seem
the white Cattleyas have been bred for hundreds of years. Blues have not.
No. They've only started really being bred since the 40s, and they're probably only 3 or 4 generations. The 2 FCCs were actually crossed in the 50s. 2 recent FCC Cattleyas, white Cattleyas, were actually crosses from the 50s.
All right, when was Bowbell's made?
1944 or something. Early 40s.
The Cattleya breeders are very lucky because most of these Cattleyas were found quite some time ago. Consider Sibylla breeding, where you're getting 3 or 4 new species every couple of years. And we don't know anything about what they have that's dominant or recessive. You got to make a wild guess.
Yeah, I think what you're doing in the cymbidiums is exactly what they did 100 years ago in the Cattleyas. Is you cross and what they did in the fails in the 60s, make all the crosses and see what is in there. And once you figure out what's in there, then you could start a real, honest to goodness, long-term breeding program. But until you know what those traits are and what they can be expressed.
I'm not planning crosses for the crosses I'm making today.
Well, you could be like my dad. My dad said he was making crosses for me because I didn't know what I was doing.
I do have a granddaughter that's very interested.
I remember the story I heard. Rodney Wilcox Jones said he couldn't die because this was when he was 100 and whatever. He couldn't die because he had to see what happened with the crosses he'd make.
So getting back to that Cattleya, how many people would have nominated that?
I don't think the sepals are where we need to be for a modern Cattleya hybrid. I think it has a nice lip form. The petals are okay, but the sepals are not as well presented as I think they should be.
I probably would have nominated it. Given given Amethystoglossa and how cupped and wavy their petals are, I would expect its offspring to be such.
Mm.
And I think it's got a good number of flowers too. If you look at my research, other Loddiglossa hybrids, I think one of the only other hybrid that was awarded had like 4 flowers on it, if I'm not mistaken.
That goes back to your slides. Did they use Loddiglossa in making that cross, or did it use a Harrisoniana?
Or a cross between the two.
I was just going to say, I bet all of the ones we're seeing are hybrids. And that would affect the flower count, flower size, not the shape, but it would affect the flower count and the size.
And I don't know, the picture to me, it looks like a pale pink flower. I don't see a Coerulea flower there, but is
It didn't
that
look Coerulea.
anybody else see Coerulea there?
I didn't think it looked all that close to a Coerulea form, a Coerulea color. There were a number of the other ones that were in the research projects that looked a lot more Coerulea than this one.
Mm-hmm.
Ken, do you have the description?
Yeah, I agree, but I don't trust pictures.
You have the description.
No, there really wasn't a description since it wasn't an awarded sort of plant, so it was just a photo we got.
We have dimensions, though. Are you interested in that, Bill?
Hmm?
Measurements.
Yeah, the more I look at that, the more I would nominate it. That's just me.
I mean, the question, I think, the question is, there's quite a bit of variability in amethystoglossas. The new ones are really spectacular. They've had some really nice amethystoglossas, 5 or 8, 9 years ago. So to me, I don't think they used one of the best amethystoglossas in making that cross.
How about the lack of spots, Ken? There are no spots in the flower where.
Yeah, I can live with that.
Yeah,
I don't need spots because amethystoglossa, yeah, it has spots, but it's not spotted like, some of the spotted cats we have today with,
well, and some amethystoglossas don't have very many spots.
right. I'm sorry, someone sent me a note and I didn't get a chance to read it before it faded away.
Ken, excuse that. Can you send me the what document you're looking at? I didn't want to do it.
Oh, you mean the website?
Oh, is that what it is? Oh, I thought you had a PowerPoint. Sorry.
No. Let me send you the website where I set up.
Okay.
May I make a comment? Ken?
Yeah, see if that works, Suzette.
May I make a comment?
Yeah, guys, if you're not actually talking, if you can mute, because we're getting a lot of feedback from some people.
I've been listening for 20, 30 minutes, most entranced by the discussion. But I've been hearing echoes consistently through this time. And so therefore what I'd like to offer on the subject is essentially impossible because of the degree of feedback. I'm torn because as the discussion is unfolding here on the particular hybrid Cattleya Loddiglossa, the way I've been thinking about evaluating it is quite different from the way the discussion is flowed, and yet the feedback is such that it's impossible to elaborate. So I don't know what's gone wrong with my connection, but something has.
I found the problem because
What?
Frank, you're on here twice. It was feeding back into yourself. So I just removed your second person.
You just got rid of me, and so now everything is cleaned up.
Yeah, you sound great now.
Well, I had no idea, in fact, how I got depicted twice at all, from the beginning. So anyway, that was beyond my control. But now everything is pure, and that's excellent. Should I comment just for a minute about how I approach this problem? Because it's from a direction quite different from what I have heard, and it's not unusual for me to feel like I'm probably coming at things often from a different direction. So let me just make a bit of a comment. Yes, Ken.
Yeah, Frank, I'm gonna go ahead and let you finish the session here tonight. Take your time, but Rob's got to get going. He's got an issue at home that he's got to take care of due to the rains.
Okay.
So you have the floor. We'll all mute, and once you're done, we'll call it an end to the meeting. Okay?
That's fine, and I won't, I'm not going to take very long. I'll just, there's corroborative material, screenshots, that reinforce the approach that I've taken. And I apologize to you, Ken. I didn't turn to this problem, of evaluation here until this afternoon because my workload has been otherwise, and my apologies for not getting at it more quickly. But my approach was this. On looking at the nature of this hybrid, I said to myself, well, here's what I have to consider. I have to consider it's a primary hybrid. So therefore, I will look at all Cattleya hybrids that have been awarded and pick out the primaries and start from that as the point of my departure. Now, of course, if you can't do this easily, you already encounter a big barrier. But I happen to be able to do this easily. So I did start from that point of view. Once I had that information, which amounted to some 500 useful pictures to look at, I was much happier having an abundance of information to whittle down than to have to work through a much narrower, several different paths that were handicapped by a lack of that degree of abundance of information. So the next thing that I did was to say, that's a pretty good sized flower. And so my next level of consideration needs to be within the Cattleya primary hybrids, those things that are within a similar size range. And the reason that I'm particularly interested in this is because, as you know, in my judging, I tend to overweight shape perhaps more than I would color. And so the shape issues here are the ones that I'm especially interested in. And that starts from the overall size in which good shape has to be accomplished. So that's why I took then the primary Cattleya hybrids that have been awarded and then sub-selected for those that have a natural spread horizontal that is somewhere between 8.0 and 11. And that, of course, is I'm in the good position of being able to make that sub-selection very rapidly. And so the numbers there that emerged dropped down some with a couple of hundred left. And so the next thing was that I needed to throw out the ones that were very short, star-shaped and very, sort of open and spindly. So out they went. And then I got to my judging experience and said, I think that for a primary hybrid, having in the Cattleya Alliance, having looked at this group of several hundred here that have survived this far, there are some interesting shape qualities that I better refine further on. And they started then with the observation, well, what do I think is the strongest quality here? It's the strongest component in that flower to pursue in terms of a further shape examination. And it's the lip. I'm very interested in the lip because I was interested in finding that kind of lip of that kind of proportion in this group of a couple of hundred things that had survived the previous screening. Well, at that point then, I looked and did a further sub-selection based upon the lip widths running from 2.5, I think, to 4.0. I think this one, the statistics on it where it was 3.2. And so I'm down now to when I finally get down to throwing out some additional refinements having to do with relative width of the petals, which also proved to be rather interesting in the group of things I was looking at, that I'm now down to perhaps considering the issue of it coming from being viewed as a Coerulea type and factoring that in. So as you can see, my approach has been a bit different, perhaps, than at least what I could hear, given the feedback challenge. And now getting closer to making a decision whether I would nominate. But I'm not quite there yet. I would make a finer determination, especially now about the individual smoothness, flatness of the sepals, and also more pictures that I'm now working with, whether or not flatness and fullerness is possible and present in some of them. And so then I have to arrive at a cutoff for where adequate shape would be in my mind for proceeding with the other qualities and attaching weights and eventually synthesizing to a total result. But I think it's fair to say that my approach here is I dissect the thing, as many of us, of course, but I started from a rather novel point of view of I'm going to treat this thing as different because it's a primary Cattleya hybrid, and see then within that constellation of information whether this is a sound hypothesis or not. And as I said, there's some screenshots that actually document the results that came in following through with this line of reasoning. So that's Ken, pretty much all I have to offer. Other than to say it seems to me to be a little different approach. I could comment on the negatives that would affect a score if I had to score it. And again, from what I've looked at, here the evidence is much sparser in terms of primary hybrids in the Cattleya Alliance to look at. But I don't like I think the arrangement here, at least that are shown in the picture that that was offered up here for the candidate. I think the arrangement is, at least to my eye, it's hardly very exciting, and in fact is less than I would hope for and expect, and I believe have already seen in some things that are primary Cattleya hybrids that have been previously awarded. You got to be careful with this kind of analysis, of course, because you've got to be careful. For example, if you're looking at things that have been put together with Loddiglossa, you've got a lot of possibilities there within how the species in the Cattleya Alliance split up, in terms of shape classification. And that's where then I would go back and investigate for Rob some of pursue your kind of argument that you've made here about evolution and improvement in the availability, through complex crosses within a species to produce, better quality species to breed with. So I'm off base, but I take some comfort in at least seeming to be off base, and that's, I guess, pretty much that what I had to offer on this. Except, Mark, part of this little lecture here was offered especially to you to encourage you to do that which I think you already do naturally and do well, which is to dissect. Dissect, take it apart, compare against the best, biggest, widest body of evidence that you can justify in the record, and then synthesize and be careful about how you weigh the factors. So that's probably too much of a lecture, but that's the way I looked at this particular challenge. And it was a great pleasure to have the luxury of being able to do this kind of research and not have to do it in 3 or 4 minutes in live judging. So I'm spoiled. And thanks for your pleasure, for your patience.
Okay, thank you, Frank.